I did have one of those moments when I reached out to you on Twitter. At first, I thought, "Is this?" Do you know when you talk to someone, you think, "Hang on, is this
Is
just?"
this the real Paul Embery? Or is it a bot?
And then when I watched,
I don't think anyone would be stupid enough to imitate me. They'd be letting themselves in for a lifetime of abuse.
uh,
Hello, and welcome to Can I Make a Point? The podcast where we listen to ideas, guests, and on some occasions, even each other. In that spirit, my name is Bradley, and I'm a Conservative, and I'll be joined every week by my friend and comrade Danny, who is a socialist.
Hi.
It's a potent blend, I know. Please subscribe and follow Liberal Base Twitter and Instagram at the handle @LiberalBase for updates and new content. On our first episode is Paul Embery, columnist and author of the book Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. In the interview, Paul explains what happened to the Labour Party in the run-up to a 2019 election, what needs to be done, and even touches on the world of the Twitter mob. But to begin with, I asked him to give us an overview of who he is and what point he wants to make.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, hi, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I am an activist within the labour and trade union movement. I've been an activist in the labour movement for most of my adult life, really. I consider myself on the left. I'm a member of the Labour Party. Been a member of the party for 26 years. I'm a firefighter by trade, but I also, as you mentioned, do a bit of writing. I'm a columnist for the Unheard website. I've just had the book published, Despised, and yeah, I try to bring my experiences into my politics. I'm passionate about the labour movement. I'm a proud member of the labour movement, but I think that the movement itself has kind of seriously lost its way. And has become very seriously out of touch with the very people it was created to represent, ordinary working class people. And I've tried to bring my insight into the reasons as to why that happened. And I grew up in a very traditional working class community, the borough of Barking and Dagenham in East London. And, you know, very much a blue collar, traditional labour heartland. And I saw the schism that emerged between the community in that place and the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement. And I think I understood going through that the reasons why it happened, and it led me into believing that a real rift was on the cards between the left and the working class. And that's really that's really what I argue. It's the theme of what I say in my book. And if some people listen to it, then it's worth doing.
In the book, I was struck by a tweet that you put out when on the 8th of December, about 4 days before the general election, where you said, "Thursday will be a pivotal day in the history of the British labour movement. If our red wall crumbles, as some of us has long predicted, it will be a time for serious and honest reflection. If we win, then I really don't understand politics as much as I thought I did. Let's see." That summed up a lot. Like, you've just mentioned them, but how do you know it was going so wrong? What was like the warning signs that, because even as a party Conservative Party member, I wasn't ready for the huge way the Tories were going to take a majority. So how did you see all that coming? What was like the warning signs?
Well, simply because I had the benefit in many respects of inhabiting the two worlds, the world of ordinary working class people in a traditional Labour working class community, but at the same time being an activist, being very deeply involved in the politics and the activities of the Labour movement. And as I sort of inhabited these two worlds, as the years went by, I began to see how they were becoming so much different from each other, and how, as I said before, that schism between the two groups was beginning to emerge. And I think that, I mean, I trace it in the book. I trace it probably to about 30 years ago, to around about the end of the 80s, when I think Labour overtly embraced what I call a poisonous blend of social and economic liberalism. But I think many working class people in those traditional working class communities are neither especially socially liberal or especially economically liberal. But Labour was going in that direction. And I think that's when they started to alienate many among their core vote. But I think it intensified particularly in the first decade of this century. And I use again my own personal experience of living in Barking and Dagenham, which is, I say, traditional blue collar community. You had the big Ford plant, the famous Ford plant, which was the local employer. People who traditionally voted Labour in a very tribal sense, all of a sudden started to feel detached from the party. And that coincided with what was going on in that community and many other, what you might call traditional working class, post-industrial communities in Britain, outside of the fashionable cities, if you like. I mean, I know Barking and Dagenham was sort of in the East End of London, but it wasn't the gentrified part of London in many respects. And in that decade, we saw the real acute impacts of globalization taking hold in these communities. In a very rapid and deep-seated way. And these communities were undergoing sudden transformation, which nobody had called for in those communities. And, before that, these were very settled and stable communities where people had lived for generations, and they saw the impacts of globalization in an economic sense, in the sense of deindustrialization and the closure of blue-collar industries, the shipping of jobs abroad. The Ford plant became a rump of its former self. Production was shipped abroad to places like Germany and stuff. And at the same time as that was happening, you saw the other effects of globalization, which was the impacts of rapid and large-scale movements of labour. So the population, for example, in Barking and Dagenham grew very significantly in that decade. There was a very, very large number of new arrivals, most of whom, by the way, were fundamentally decent people, but nonetheless it created pressures. It created social and cultural pressures. It created pressures on local services, etc. And people in those communities looked to their traditional representatives in the Labour Party and said, look, we're not comfortable about this. And it wasn't a kind of racist feeling. It was a feeling of disorientation and bewilderment. The sudden profound effects of globalization in their communities, and the Labour Party pretty much said to them, look, you'll have to suck it up. This is the way of the world. Our GDP will be better as a nation. You might be 20 quid a month better off. And, this is multiculturalism. You should embrace it. And I have to say, as somebody, I was in my early 20s at the time, and I was pretty relaxed about the whole thing, and thought actually, these sort of small c socially conservative communities like Barking and Dagenham need a bit of a shake-up. But you get to the end of that period and you suddenly understand that actually people have a real sense of community and a sense of belonging and a sense of place. And if you violate that so suddenly through things like rapid and large scale movements of capital and labour, you cause social and economic disruption. And I was pretty clear from that moment onward that unless Labour addressed those concerns and shifted its thinking, it was going to lose millions of those votes, and it did.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose over the last 5 years, particularly I think for my own politics, I very much started at that kind of Corbyn sort of mold, and the last 5 years has really started to make me move towards, sort of more a blue Labour sort of position, Maurice Glassman, that kind of position. But there's many people who see Corbynism, the last 5 years as the start of that problem. I know you've touched on it already, but do you agree with the analysis that Corbynism is where this all started, or do you think it's a much longer term problem for the Labour Party? And if so, how early would you go?
I think it started well before Corbyn, and I think there are some people in the Labour Party now who misunderstand what's been going on. I think they believe that the rupture between the party and the working class only began when Corbyn took charge, and that all we have to do, if we go back to some kind of Blairite centrism where very much supporters and cheerleaders of globalization, the very thing that impacted so profoundly in working class communities. Those who think that we just go back to the way things were before Corbyn, I think are fundamentally misdiagnosing the problem. As I say, I think you can probably trace back the schism to around about 30 years ago. But particularly in the last sort of 15, 20 years, I think it's intensified. I mean, there's no doubt that Corbyn was broadly unpopular, I think, in many traditional working class communities. I think the whole kind of Brexit thing undoubtedly had a big impact as well. Labour's vacillations over Brexit, the kind of second referendum pledge, which I think was suicidal electorally. All of those things had an impact. I think, you know, there was a hostile media to Corbyn. I think that probably had some impact as well. But, you know, these problems are very, very deep-seated and have been long in the making. I mean, like Labour, for example, hasn't won the popular vote in England since 2001. So we need to understand why the rot set in. We need to understand when it's set in, and that involves a lot of hard thinking, and it involves going back well before Corbyn took over.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that, just sort of building on the whole Corbynism thing, do you think that Corbyn had a valuable role in sort of reorientating the Labour Party around a more, social democratic economic agenda? Because, like you were saying, you know, it was all part of a economically liberal, culturally liberal sort of ideology that created the problem. Do you think that is like a positive contribution that Corbynism made, or do you think that Corbynism has caused more damage than good to the cause?
I do think he made a positive contribution in terms of the economics of it. I mean, I think people often think that I should, because of my politics, be a vociferous anti-Corbynite. But, you know, I say credit where it's due. And as I say in the book that, you know, I think he was right to reorientate the Labour Party in favour of a much clearer anti-austerity position. I think that whereas previous Labour leaders had been, if you like, austerity light, where they'd said, you know, we will make serious cuts and we will impose austerity, we'll just be a bit softer than the Tories at doing it. I think Corbyn was right to say, actually, there's, you know, the moral case against austerity is strong, but actually there's an economic case against it which needs articulating, in fact, re-articulating. You know, I would argue, as I say in the book, that I think many people on the left have forgotten the lessons of the 1930s, the likes of John Maynard Keynes, who taught us actually, you know, austerity and cutting and slashing is in many respects the worst response to a flatlining economy. All you do is suck activity out of the economy, drive down your tax revenues, increase unemployment, etc. And what you need to do is maintain levels of investment to keep your tax revenues up, strive for full employment, etc., etc. Now, obviously, that's a much wider economic debate, but I was very happy as a trade unionist, as someone on the left, to see Corbyn take that line. And I think actually, to be fair, some of that stuff, you know, Corbynomics as it was called, was actually quite popular in some of those working class communities. I don't think there's necessarily a need for Labour to step back from some of that stuff. I think if you speak to people in those working class communities, they do say actually the economy is fundamentally unfair. Actually, it is skewed in favour of the rich and against working class people. The gap between rich and poor is too wide. We think there are regional disparities which need addressing. We don't like boardroom excesses. So some of that was broadly popular, I think. I think where he fouled and where previous Labour leaders have fouled was on the cultural divide. I don't think he did anything to close that. In fact, probably made it worse, if truth be told.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I think after the 2019 election, it was quite, and I noticed this and I thought it was a dangerous trend. Like, the people on my side of the debate on the right suddenly went, "This is Corbyn." But what do you say to people, for example, like Lord Adonis, who argued that there needs to be a return back to third wayism of like the Blairite era? What would you say to people like that say, actually, it isn't that people are against the social liberalism, it's actually the fact that, to quote Blair recently, said that he's pushing a crypto socialism, whatever Blair thinks that means. But what do you say to people like Blair and Lord Adonis, who argue that there needs to be a return back to Blairism?
I think they're completely wrong. I think they're completely wrong. Blairism was largely a kind of economically liberal, stroke socially liberal agenda, and I think that under Blair, the rupture between working class communities, red wall communities, whatever you want to call them, and the Labour Party intensified. And the idea that all we need to do is go back there. And I think this is the danger, and you see a bit of this in America as well. Actually, that there are people on the left here and in America who think that what's happened in recent years in both countries is just some kind of temporary blip. It's like a bit of an aberration. Brexit was an aberration. The collapse of the Red Wall was an aberration. The election of Donald Trump was an aberration. And, you know, once we're over those things, we can go back to some sort of normality. So you see Democrats in America saying, you know, we're going to return to normality, or normalcy, as they call it in America. You know, this Trump thing was just an aberration. Let's go back to how we were. You see it with some people on the left saying Brexit and Corbyn and the 2019 election was an aberration. Let's go back to centrism as it was. I think that's a real danger because, as I say, many of the roots of the rift between Labour and working class people was set during those years when Blair was in charge. You know, the people, you know, the third way, Anthony Giddens and all that philosophy that Blair embraced, which was pretty much an embrace of globalisation. Had very, very profound, it took a few years for them to be seen, but they had very profound and acute effects in those working class communities. And when those effects did eventually start to emerge, that's when people, when they looked at Labour and thought, actually, you are pushing this stuff on us. You know, we're in the predicament that we are because of the policies that you're embracing. So it would be a real danger if Labour goes back to those days. I think it would not do anything to heal that divide.
Yeah. So I think you're right in the fact that Labour has embraced this social liberalism in a way. And as I read your book, you, in my view, rightfully do criticise that the wide-ranging woke identity politics of things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the whole trans right movement and stuff like that. And I think that for a lot of people, that brings them a sense of collective belonging. But as a person on the right, what interests me as I was reading your book is, do you see that class warfare or a class-based identity politics is a substitute for liberal identity wokedom? Do you see that as a reasonable kind of replacement of the identity politics that's engrossed the left quite recently?
I think it's an interesting question because, you know, I'm not a class warrior. I'm not somebody who says, you know, I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat and let's string all the ruling class from the nearest lamppost. I do know people who do argue for those things.
You surprised me, Paul.
But I'm not one of them myself. So I don't believe in class war, but nonetheless, you know, there's no doubt that there is a class divide in the country, and that it should be, in my view, the left and the Labour Party who should be, as it has done historically, fighting to advance the interests of the working class. And I think society is fundamentally unfair. I think that the economy is fundamentally unfair. I think working class people broadly don't get the deal that they deserve in this country. And I think that Labour, without falling into the trap of class war, which, you know, some people, frankly, in the Labour Party have done, particularly over the last 5 years, and without falling into the trap, as you say in your question, of seeing the class war as some sort of replacement for the identity war. No, I think we need to yes, talk about class more on the left, and we need to talk about community more, because I think identity politics itself has been an absolute bear pit and has been extremely divisive, and has frankly fragmented, I think, the working class and made it difficult for us on the left to fight back, because we are just constantly emphasising our separateness from other working class people. So I believe in a thing called the working class. I believe in advancing the interests of the working class. I've articulated in the book the ways I think that can be done, but I don't think that a class war should be a substitute for the current sort of war over identity. No.
Just building on your understanding of the working class, in the book you say, my working class is what might legitimately be described as the traditional working class, but that is not a euphemism for white. It would include, for example, the West Indian who came to Britain as part of the Windrush generation and worked on London's transport system, the Muslim who settled in a Lancashire mill town, my own late father-in-law who came in the 1960s from India and was employed as a sheet metal worker, and so on. And so, Paul, I'm going to ask you, are you a racist and a xenophobe?
Well, I mean, no, of course I'm not. But you know, I can see why you might ask that question, because if you go onto Twitter, then you'll see certain people just throwing these accusations all the time. But anyone who actually takes time to listen to what I say, to read what I say, I think just simply wouldn't come to that conclusion. And part of the problem, I think, you see this so much on the left, is people will try to pigeonhole you and stereotype your views, you know, without actually taking time to understand them. And you know, you may have seen some of it yourself, some of the commentary upon the release of my book from other people on the left, including large numbers of people who hadn't even read it and probably had no intention of reading it, but nonetheless knew that it was a fascist tract and that it was a manifesto for the far right, and all of this stuff. And of course, you've read it and you can see that that's absolute nonsense. So part of, you know, and funnily enough, you know, part of the book is dedicated to you know, what I call the word inflation of things like racist and fascist, things that not long ago had a very defined meaning, and you know, people understood what they meant, but have now been used in such a kind of ubiquitous, widespread way that they've lost all meaning. And that frankly is something that the left has got to get to grips with. We cannot just keep condemning people as racist because, for example, they oppose free movement. Or because, for example, they raise concerns over multiculturalism. We need to start understanding people, listening to people more, and stop trying to you know, dismiss them as bigots and xenophobes.
Definitely, I'm with you on that one. I mean, I've looked at your Twitter, and you know, it's some of the most appalling abuse. You know, and like you say, people who haven't even read the book commenting on it. So, but in the book, you lay out a set of ideas. You know, obviously you're a member of the Labour Party, that could be applied in the Labour Party. You know, you've obviously got a commentary about Labour, in a sense, decoupling with its traditional, the people it was built to represent. If you want to frame it that way, how do you believe these sorts of ideas that you've come up with should be applied to the party itself? Like what tangible things need to change? You know, for example, does there need to be a quota for a certain amount of working class MPs to be in the Parliamentary Labour Party? You know.
No, I don't particularly believe there should be a quota, although certainly the Labour Party has got to work extremely hard to bring more working class people into the organisation. I mean, as I say, as I say in the book, the latest survey of the Labour Party membership shows that 77% of members belong in the ABC1 occupational middle class category. Many of them living in southern England, many of them graduates. Now, I don't say for a second that those people don't belong in the party. Of course they do, and the Labour Party has traditionally always been that when it's been its most successful, the Labour Party has been a coalition of what I describe as Hartlepool and Hampstead. So Hartlepool being its traditional working class base, the blue collar communities that Labour was set up to represent in the first place, but also attracting a layer of, if you like, more middle class liberals who are favourable to the ideas of the Labour Party and want a fairer economy, support a Labour government. And when Labour has been able to bring both parts of that coalition together and hold them together, that's when it's won elections. I think where Labour went wrong is that it appealed so much to the middle classes and, you know, people, the urban liberals living in our fashionable cities, etc., and the sort of graduate, professional and managerial classes, that it forgot its working class base, and it became so overtly in favour of the first group that it forgot the second group. Partly, I think, because it probably thought that they had nowhere else to go. The working class element had nowhere else to go, and took them for granted. And, you know, the result now is that Labour is largely a party of students and social activists and middle class liberals living in the cities, particularly London. And, you know, Hartlepool has now been elbowed aside. So it needs to bring back that coalition. It needs to have a radical overhaul in terms of its thinking. It needs to, frankly, start talking about the issues that matter to people in working class communities, the things that come up on the doorstep, which ordinary working class people often want to talk about, but Labour activists find a bit embarrassing, and they stare down at the ground and shuffle their feet in embarrassment when those issues come up. You know, Labour activists, in my experience, are not particularly comfortable talking about things like law and order and immigration and national security. And family and all of this stuff, which they think of as traditional kind of Tory values. That's right-wing stuff. We're much happier talking about climate change and trans rights and migrant rights and Black Lives Matter, and all of this stuff. Now, we need to discuss all of those things. You know, I say climate change, for example, you'd be a fool not to, as a mainstream party, not to want to discuss climate change. But the problem is, for many people in working class communities who were once tribally Labour, those sort of more middle class issues are what they see as secondary issues. They don't not think they're important, but they just kind of think, look, we expect politicians to deal with those things. Climate change, for example, we expect politicians to deal with that. It's clearly an issue. Go off and deal with it. But when I speak to, you know, my local Labour councillor or candidate on the doorstep, I want them to know what they're going to do about the drug dealer at the corner of my I want them to know, I want them to tell me how they're going to get my son or my daughter on the housing ladder when, you know, rents are out of control and we don't build enough houses. I want them to be able to tell me what the immigration policy is going to be, because, you know, we've experienced the serious effects of an oversupply of labour in my local industry or my local community. So Labour needs to get back to speaking about the issues that ordinary working class people want to speak about, and it needs to change itself, because too often I think when people who once upon a time voted Labour, they look at the Labour Party now and they feel as if they're treated as some sort of embarrassing elderly relative. You know, the Labour Party doesn't really look like them anymore. It doesn't really talk like them. It doesn't really make them feel very welcome. And until the Labour Party starts embracing people in those communities and stops treating them like an embarrassing elderly relative, then it's not going to win their hearts and minds back.
Yeah. I was interested when you talked about that. And do you think there's a sense of denial in the left? For example, I mean, you tweeted out and you mentioned it in front when Keir Starmer sat in front of the flag before doing his speech. You said there's a lot of people that are going to have some reaction to this, and then I think it was Red Labour, I think that was the Twitter feed, that posted up a picture and started deriding Keir Starmer. Do you think there's a sense of denial on the left of what's really happened?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there are people on the left who, frankly, haven't had the courage, if you like, to face up to what happened in December 2019 and the reasons why it happened. And what I find often, I mean, I've been an activist on the left for 26 years or more. What I find is things are sometimes very simple. Things are sometimes quite straightforward. And what the left often does, particularly the far left, I have to say, they will try to find kind of convoluted sociological reasons, contrived political reasons often, to explain things that are inconvenient to them. So you say to them, look, the reason we lost the 2019 election is because we alienated millions of working class people because of our view on Brexit, whatever it was in the end. Corbyn was unpopular, but also because for the last 30 years, we've been alienating these people because we embrace globalization and we embrace free movement, and we forgot the politics of belonging and the politics of community. And we forgot that most human beings, especially people in those communities, are social and parochial beings with an attachment to place. And because we forgot all that, and because we became so kind of middle class in our outlook and in our demographic, and we embraced, the precepts of cosmopolitan liberalism, that's why we alienated millions of blue collar communities. That's the truth of it. But, you find that people on the left simply don't want to face up to that, because if they did, they would come to conclusions that they're not happy with, and it would involve them challenging their own very, very established thinking, and they're not prepared to do it. So they come to false conclusions, and they use phrases like false consciousness. The working class voted for Boris Johnson through false consciousness, and they didn't really understand, what the Labour Party was going to do for them. Sometimes you've just got to confront that stuff head on and say it's rubbish, and to keep explaining to people why it was that we lost. I think some people have got it. I think some people understand that unless the left does reconnect with those communities and start speaking their language and understanding, things like patriotism and community, then it's never going to win them back. Some people are getting it, I think.
Yeah. So building on that, you talk about changing the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer's been quite speaking about the importance of family, sitting in front of a union flag, came out and said he wouldn't want to start doing freedom movement again. Do you think Keir Starmer is the right person to lead and bring about these changes, or do you think he's electioneering, like making sure? Do you think it's just a play, or do you think he generally does know what needs to happen?
I think he probably does understand what needs to happen. I don't think necessarily he gets it instinctively in terms of why people feel the way they do in working class communities. For example, I'm pretty sure that Keir Starmer is a strong enthusiast for free movement. I mean, there's no question. He's a strong enthusiast for free movement. He was vociferously against leaving the European Union. I think he kind of comes from that tradition of Blairite middle class liberal centrism. He's a North London lawyer. I don't think he has a natural affinity with people in Stoke-on-Trent, for example. But nonetheless, I think what he's done has been better than nothing. I think he certainly wasn't my leader of choice, and I didn't actually vote for any of the candidates in the end, because I don't think any of them really got it. But I do think he's done okay, to be fair, and credit where it's due. I mean, I think if you look at his position on Brexit, I think he's done the right thing. I think from the day that he became leader, he said, right, we've got to have Brexit as a non-issue going forward. It needs to be done. We need to recognise it's done. He whipped his MPs to vote for the deal. He's saying, look, there's no rejoining the EU is not on the agenda. As you say, he said on the Mar programme at the weekend that there should be no return to free movement. His conference speech in September, I mean, obviously it was only a speech to camera, but it was still a conference speech where he talked about, community, nation, family. I think all of that stuff's important, but there's a mountain to climb, and it needs to be fleshed out in policy. It can't just be gimmicky, because people will see through that. And I think the next couple of years, in terms of that direction, whether or not he's not just saying it, but actually he's devising policies to reflect that stuff, I think that's going to be telling. So it's going to be an important year or two.
Just sort of moving away from the Labour Party and moving towards trade unionism itself. Obviously, you're a trade union man. You're part of the Fire Brigade Union. Do you think that there needs to be changes within trade unions as well as the Labour Party? Along the lines of what the book describes, to do with the woke identity politics and sort of reconnecting with those ex-industrial skilled working class voters?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's been a real tragedy that there are so many millions of workers today in precarious employment that are just not represented by trade unions, and in some cases, frankly, don't know what a trade union is. I mean, if you look since 1980, the number of members of trade unions in this country has halved. I think it's down from about 13 million to about 6.5 million now. Obviously, in part, that's due to deindustrialization. You know, the big heavy industries and, you know, the manufacturing base that we used to have that were heavily unionized are just not there anymore. But you do have things like call centers right across the country employing hundreds of people, thousands of people. You have things like, you know, these huge new warehouses where people are just not represented by trade unions, but are often on low wages and you know, not enjoying very good conditions. So there's no reason other than, you know, I think a lack of strategy and a lack of will on the part of trade unions to reach those people. The truth is, trade unions are largely unrepresented in private industry. They've, as I say in the book, they've retreated to their public sector comfort zone. And I think in tandem with that have too often become the voice of what I call the London liberal class. And that means, yes, they have been immersed too much in some of this stuff around identity politics and wokeness, and have not concentrated as much as they should on things like pay and conditions and the state of the economy, etc. And I think that's really sad, because as you say, I'm a passionate trade unionist. I believe that workplaces and the country are much the better for trade unions, and you know, what's happened, I think, has been to the detriment of workers and to the country itself.
Definitely.
So I've obviously said from my position, I'm on the centre right. I'm a conservative, and when I read your book, what I thought was interesting is, as I was reading, there's a lot I agreed with. The economics, by the by, but I thought what was interesting is that the argument you made in the book is similar to the platform Johnson ran on in 2019. So, what do you say to conservatives like myself that essentially say that the Tories have took your plan, and why should people continue not to vote for the Tories if they're essentially going on the platform you want?
It's a really interesting point. I mean, I think that, I mean, with Boris Johnson, for example, I don't think, frankly, he really does understand those red wall seats. I think he probably had people working for him, the likes of Dominic Cummings, who probably did understand those people in those communities a lot more, and helped to sort of craft the Tory strategy for that general election. I think actually Boris Johnson is very much a sort of social liberal and economic liberal at heart. But I think also they realised that Brexit was a big thing, that, you know, they needed to appeal to people in those communities which traditionally they've never really got a foothold in, and they could do that using the Brexit vote and their commitment to get Brexit done as a vehicle to win the votes of people in those communities. And they sort of combined that with talk about, you know, ending austerity potentially, which I don't think they have done. I don't think they will do. But they also combined it with some of the traditional Labour movement talk about, you know, addressing regional inequalities and levelling up and investment in infrastructure and public projects and all of this sort of stuff, which was very much once upon a time the bread and butter stuff of the left. So yeah, they very much did steal Labour's clothes, or, you know, what was once upon a time Labour's clothes. I think the test will come as to whether or not they deliver, because it's, you know, frankly, you can promise anything at an election. It's about whether or not you deliver it. And obviously, with the whole COVID thing, that might throw a spanner in the works for the Tories as well. And I think what will happen is, because I think we need to understand what it took for many people in those communities to vote Tory for the first time. It was very much a stigma previously, where people just said, look, we live in Mansfield or Wakefield or Bolsover, wherever it is, you know, we're working class, we shouldn't really vote Tory. You know, people talked about how when they were in the ballot box, they had their grandfather whispering over their shoulder, the ghost of their grandfather saying, don't vote Tory and stuff like that. So it was a big leap for people to do that. And I think that unless the Tories are seen to repay that trust, then people won't do it again. But having done it once, if the Tories do deliver in those communities and do the things they're promising to tangibly improve the lives of the people in those communities, it's going to be a lot less hard for people to vote Tory a second time than it was the first time. So it will all be about the delivery. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that if the Tories don't deliver and people don't vote Tory again in those communities, they'll automatically go back to Labour. I don't think they will. I think they'll either abstain or vote for one of the minor parties. So Labour can't take for granted the government's failure if they fail. Labour has got to move heaven and earth to try to reconnect on its own programme towards people in those communities. And just briefly on that point, I think the danger for Labour is if they fall into the trap of believing that things can't get any worse. Actually, if you look at a lot of the seats that Labour held on to, some of the majorities are quite narrow. So if the Tories do deliver and Labour don't get their act together, then things could get worse for Labour.
I do think that's poignant, because I think the difference will be in 2024 as well. The option won't just be the Brexit Party, Labour, Conservatives and Lib Dems. You can see a lot of smaller parties, like Lawrence Fox, for example, has started a party. Nigel Farage is keeping up this, I don't want to be in politics more, I'm going to keep creating parties. So I think that for Labour, that would be that. Do you have any hope then that Boris Johnson is going to, let's say COVID gets sorted out and Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister, do you think, now that Dominic Cummings is gone, do you think are you a bit worried that there might be a return back to Cameron-esque conservatism, or do you think he might?
I think there could be. I think that other than Brexit, I don't think there was much distinguishable in terms of the politics and economics of the likes of Cameron and Boris Johnson. And yes, it's true that I think Dominic Cummings was, if you like, the person behind the scenes who was responsible for much of the messaging in terms of those overtures to those Red Wall constituencies and appealing to them in a way that I don't think Boris Johnson would have been capable of. So yeah, I think there's certainly post-Brexit and post-COVID, there is a potential, I think, for the Tory party to revert to type and just go back to the old way of thinking, where actually, these Red Wall communities, they're not our natural supporters, they're not our natural base. Why are we speaking their language? Why are we aiming at them? I guess as a Labour Party member, part of me might be thinking, good, let the Tories abandon those communities and let us move back onto that territory. But actually, it's about more than the politics. It's about people in those communities who deserve to be listened to and deserve to have their lives improved by government of whatever colour, and whatever government is in power. I would appeal to them, not to forget those people, because they did it. Both main parties did it for many, many years, and look where it led us.
Yeah. Just turning to some more recent events. For those watchers who don't know, Paul recently quoted an NHS statistic on Twitter that said the number of COVID-related deaths in England involving individuals under the age of 60 and free from a pre-existing condition is 377. This is for the entire period of the pandemic, and the source was NHS England, so no fake news here. And so, Paul, I'm gonna ask you, as it was characterised by the Twitter storm, do you want to kill Grandma?
Well, according to Twitter, yeah, of course I do. I want to terminate all people over the age of 60, because naturally I'm a fascist and eugenicist. But again, it's Twitter, isn't it? It's the pitchfork wielders on Twitter who.
Do you find this abandonment of fact a bit worrying, though? This abandonment of rationality and of just looking at facts and people thinking for themselves rather than with an ideological head.
Yeah, I think it is worrying, actually. I think if you take a view on something and you back that view up with facts, with verifiable facts, or even if you don't take a view but you just circulate facts, then if people disagree with you, or if people think your facts are wrong, then let them come out and explain. Let them put their counter arguments and their counter evidence, and let's have a civilized debate about it. But it's bizarre that you can, as in my case, you quote a statistic provided by NHS England from their website on one of their spreadsheets, and you present it in the way that they themselves present it. And the sky falls in because people just accuse you of, as you say, in that case, wanting to abandon the elderly. I think a certain part of it is simply because people just enjoy the phenomenon of being part of a social media pack. I think they think that it gives them some kind of kudos to denounce somebody who's expressed an alternative opinion, which might be in the minority. People will misrepresent you for political convenience often. But yeah, it's bizarre, it's disturbing that something that is very obviously, in this case, was very obviously a fact and was actually in that case posted without comment, can invite such abuse and criticism. It doesn't bother me on a personal level, but I think it is a reflection on parts of society, and certainly parts of social media that take the approach to debate in this way.
I mean, it did make me laugh. I'm of the skeptical Peter Hitchens school of thought on lockdowns, but I thought it was just funny that when I watched the whole thread, I saw you put it up, and then I saw the reactions, and I was like, hang on, all he's done is quoted the NHS statistic, and I was sat back and I went, hang on a minute. So
Yeah.
I was saying this to Daniel, that I thought in a sense that lots of people probably would be outraged unless you said 2 and 2 is 5. It was very much a reaction. And within that, what do you make of, like, so obviously we've had the abhorrent acts in the Capitol in America, and then the recent banning of Trump, and then we had the talk radio was taken down. I was wondering what you made of the whole rise of big tech and the amount of power they've seemed to hold over people's lives now, and what you think needs to be done about that.
It's a fascinating subject, and yeah, I think there's no question that big tech now wields huge power over our lives and over debate in the public sphere. And so many of these corporations tend to have something of a monopoly, really, on what's said and how it's said. And I think that's worrying, and I think it kind of runs counter to what people expected of the internet when it started to emerge, 30 years ago or whatever, where 25 years ago, I guess, where people said this is going to be great because this is going to allow ordinary people to take on establishment thinking. We're not just going to rely on the Daily Telegraph and the Times and the Sun. We're going to be able to have our own debates, and we're going to be able to challenge received wisdom. And in fact, what you're seeing is the power to, if you like, clamp down on opinion, concentrated in a few hands, just like it was before. And I remember when Twitter came around, 10 or 11 years ago, and I joined it fairly early. And even the people who created it said, this is going to be great. This is going to be an arena for free speech, for argument, for debate, and all of that kind of thing. And you're increasingly seeing all of that stuff being suffocated. And it's all very well. People say, I've heard the argument in relation to Trump over the last few days that, well, it's a private company, they can do what they like. Well, in a literal sense, I guess that's probably true. But the people who provide the water that runs to your house are a private company. If they take a dislike to what you say, do they have the right to cut your water off? The gas provider, the people who operate the local buses, people who won't let you get on their private railway because you've said something that they don't like. There's a danger in saying that because it's a private company, forget about it. Let them do what they like, particularly when that private company has such a monopoly. So yeah, it's a danger. I think it's a threat. I think it's all of a piece with the general kind of atmosphere within society, which has infected society at the top levels now, in our public services and in public debate, where people kind of insist there's one rigid conformist view on a particular argument. And if you step outside of that, these people don't say, well, actually, I disagree with you, and here's why. More often than not, they're saying, well, that's offensive, or you shouldn't be allowed to say that, as if that's a clincher in the debate, and the debate should go no further. And it smacks of a degree of McCarthyism, I have to say. I mean, I don't want to overplay it, but I've been reading recently, just by coincidence, some of the stuff with Senator McCarthy in the States back in the 50s. And the witch hunting that was going on then, and anyone who thinks that sort of thing can't happen now, I think is seriously naive.
Definitely.
You've just mentioned Trump, and he brings up a lot. I was wondering, because obviously you for the last 4 years Daniel as well, and me have been watching Remainers in the UK try and overturn an election. I was just wondering what you made of the FBPE crowd on Twitter suddenly having a go at Trump for not accepting an election when they spent the last 4 years trying to overturn one decision. Do you not think there's some funny irony there that they don't seem to see?
Yeah, of course there is. And to any neutral observer, they would see exactly what that irony or that hypocrisy is. But of course, these people who did everything they could to try to subvert the outcome of the referendum just simply can't accept that there are any parallels at all between Trump not accepting the outcome of the election there. And it's almost, people said to me, well, it's not the same because, Remainers in Britain didn't storm Parliament to try and get their way. And as I said on Twitter, well, they didn't really need to because people inside were already doing the business for them. The idea, which is effectively what they were saying, well, we used non-violent means to try and subvert the vote in the UK, and Trump's people are using violent means. It doesn't strike me as the strongest argument. I mean, I have to say, I think that what happened after the referendum in this country and the way in which large parts of the political establishment, left and right actually, conspired to do everything they could to subvert that vote through all sorts of political chicanery and bureaucratic manoeuvrings, I thought was appalling, and it shouldn't be forgotten. What we saw is a democratic vote, a referendum. Everybody, knew what that referendum was about. Are we going to stay in the European Union, or are we going to leave? It didn't say about, are we going to leave it with a deal? That wasn't on the ballot. It was, are we going to stay or are we going to leave? And people voted to leave. The way in which the political establishment in this country tried to stop that happening was disgraceful, and actually, was ultimately no different from what they tried to do in America. Those who tried to thwart the outcome of the election in America, and we shouldn't let them forget it.
Just one last question. We'll let you get back to your dinner. If you could pick 3 people that have inspired your politics, who would you choose and why?
That's a good question. These are not necessarily people I've known personally, and some of them are obviously historical figures. Someone like Clement Attlee, for example, is a hero of mine. If you look at what he did in that post-war Labour government, when he came in 1945, won Labour's first landslide. This was at a time when the country was on its knees and almost bankrupt, and managed to transform the lives of millions of working class people. Gave us a national health service, a welfare state, built lots and lots of council homes where people had previously been living in slums. Took some industries into public ownership, which I think was the right thing to do. So someone like him. Somebody who I do know, Maurice Glasman, he's a good friend of mine, but a bit of a hero of mine. He's the founder of Blue Labour, and has been arguing the things that I argue long before I started arguing them, and was quite visionary in that respect. So somebody like him as well. I would also say someone, I'm asked this question actually from time to time. I often chop and change the answers. It's whoever I sort of thinking of at the time. But someone else that I really admired was a guy called Ron Todd, who was a trade union leader. He was around back in the 1970s and 1980s. He was at the head of the Transport and General Workers Union. And in later years of his life lived fairly close to me in Dagenham, but was a very principled trade unionist who fought for his members. He actually fought as a Royal Marine in the Second World War as well, and just happened to be someone who I admired as well. But if you ask me this tomorrow, I'd probably come up with two answers.
Thank you, Paul, for giving us this time. And if people want to find out more about you and want to follow along with your work or what you're doing, where could they go to do that?
I guess the 2 most obvious places I'm pretty active on Twitter, as you said, and it's just at Paul Embery, my name on Twitter. Also on the Unheard website, I'm a regular columnist for Unheard. So you can go on the Unheard website and click on my name to see some of my columns, or you can order the book. And obviously the book is the place where I'm able to set out my ideas more comprehensively. So people are free to have a read of that as well, I guess.
Excellent. So what we'll do is we'll leave a link to Paul's Twitter in the bottom and the link to the Unheard website. And just thank you for allowing us to use up your time, Paul.
Thank you, guys. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks for watching and listening. If you like the podcast, or you're a politics junkie, or you just like my face, go and hit the subscribe button now to keep up to date with new episodes. This is the first in a series of podcasts by Liberal Base called Can I Make a Point? We'll be releasing new episodes at 4 every Monday afternoon. If there's things you want us to cover or things you want us to try more of, let us know in the comments or get in touch via Twitter at the handle @LiberalBase. That's all for now, but head on over to liberalbase.com for more content, or you can wait until next Monday for the next episode. But for now, it's goodbye from me and Bradley.
Bye.